I wrote this book last year, and hence I think I was invited along to talk about sustainability today. The problem with my pitch is that I think that sustainability is dead. I think that sustainability as a term has gone past its sell-by date. I don't believe that it has much meaning, and I believe to all intents and purposes it has failed to deliver on any of the promises that it made when the term was first coined about 20 years ago. So a bit like the parrot in Monty Python, there are plenty of people who still believe it's alive, but in my view it's actually well dead. Now, just to give you some background about why I think sustainability is dead, it'd be good to zoom out a bit and let's take an overview of our whole country. Now, people who study geography, or I think most people would realize after the end of the Ice Age, Ireland was covered in forests, but all those forests were chopped down. After the forests were chopped down, they were mostly replaced with farms. And until recently, those farms still had quite a lot of wildlife on them. There would have been no such thing as pollution. There would have been a lot of birds nesting in farmers' fields. There were certainly lots of flowers. But since the 1950s, 60s, and increasing steadily ever since, our farms have lost their biodiversity. Today, most farms look like this, which is effectively a desert with one type of grass and maybe some clover. Certainly, there are no birds in this. There are no insects. There are no flowers. Farming, of course, is one of the biggest pressures on water quality. The Environmental Protection Agency tells us that over half of our rivers are polluted. Their recent report identified how over 500 sites in Ireland which were identified as pristine 30 years ago, only 21 of those remain pristine today. This river here in the photograph is the River Boyne in County Meath. It's part of a special protection area and a special area of conservation, and so is nominally at least one of the most important areas for conservation in the country. But as you can see, there's not a huge amount of going on, and that's because the river has been drained. Many years ago, diggers went in. You can see they straightened the river and piled the contents on the banks, and what was once a functioning river is now basically little more than a drain. And over 11,500 kilometres of rivers are drained like this every year. In our mountains, we have an awful lot of plantation forestry, which has been imposed on the landscape since the 1950s. Where the trees are planted, whatever habitat was there before is gone. The way the trees are grown, they're very tightly packed, they're very dark, nothing grows in them, there's no wildlife in them. And when they're felled, you get what's called clear felling, like you see in the front of this picture, where basically everything is chopped down at once. And this results in an awful lot of pollution. The Environmental Protection Agency, again, identified clear felling and forestry as one of the major pressures on water quality in the country. So most of our mountains now look like this. Where they haven't been covered in forestry plantations, our mountains are also burnt routinely. This happens every year, illegal wildfires spread across the country, so that most of our mountains today really are degraded, don't have much wildlife in them, contribute to flooding, release carbon instead of absorbing carbon, and are no longer home to wildlife. Most of our bogs today look something like this. This is the site of an industrial cutover bog somewhere in the Midlands. And here's the circle. This pie chart shows you the extent of raised bogs that existed. And you can see the ever diminishing slices of the pie show how the bog has shrank over the years. The tiny little sliver at the top, representing less than 1%, is the amount of our bogs that is left intact. Basically, our bogs are gone. The problems don't end on the land. At sea, most of our water is trawled. The picture on the right shows you a picture from the Marine Institute that shows you the extent of bottom trawling around the Irish coast. Bottom trawling involves scraping the bottom of the sea, And the picture on the right shows you the contents of a net after scraping the bottom of the sea. This picture is taken from a prawn trawler. As you can see, there aren't very many prawns in it. It's mostly young fish and other marine life. Most of this catch is thrown away. So bottom trawling is one of the main pressures on our seas, has led to chronic overfishing all around our coast, and continues to result in enormous levels of waste. To look at our biodiversity in general, as part of the study, research I did for my book, I came to a figure of 115 different types of plants and animals that have become extinct in Ireland since the arrival of humans. Now, some have been extinct for a very long time, and most recently, the corn bunting went extinct in the 1980s. Many of our birds of prey, went extinct in the 1900s and the 1800s. And today, one of the problems we have is not so much that all these species have gone extinct, but also about a third of everything that's left is threatened with extinction. So some of the species of fish and birds that you see there are really on the verge of extinction. The corncrake is practically extinct. The curlew is down to about 200 pairs, down from many thousands. The eel was once common nearly everywhere and is now a critically endangered species. So when you put all that together, our land has been ecologically seriously degraded, and our nature is in a very bad place. So this brings us back to the idea of sustainability. Now, one of the things that provoked me to write the book was an advertising campaign from Board Bia on Origin Green nearly 5 years ago. And in their original ad, they said that sustainability has always been the source of who we are. Our fields have always been this green and windswept. Our seas have always teemed with fish. And it was this misconnection that I thought, how can people say these things? How can people think these things when actually the real picture is very much different? This is a more recent screen grab from Origin Green. And as you can see, the message is still very much Ireland is green and environmentally healthy. And they use this word sustainable all of the time. So for me, the use of the word sustainable, if this word can be applied to something like Origin Green, well then surely it has very little meaning. Last year, the Environmental Protection Agency released a list of what it saw as the most polluting, or the kind of like a name and shame list of the companies with the worst level of compliance. One of those companies said on its website, environmental care, sustainable practices, and caring for our people have always been core values. Our participation in Origin Green have dovetailed easily with our pre-existing sustainability agenda, and it complements the ethos of the company perfectly. This particular company was listed by the EPA as one of the worst non-compliance licensees in the country, and it was on Origin Green. And as part of the Irish Wildlife Trust, we were responsible for getting this story into the media, and it highlighted how there is a contradiction between the advertising slogans and the reality on the ground. Here's another one of our esteemed state agents. It's Bord na Móna, which has been largely responsible for the destruction of the bogs since the 1950s. And as you can see, Bord na Móna is naturally driven to provide a sustainable future. Here's a news story from only a few weeks ago, and it showed how Bord na Móna is using the kernels from palm oil imported from Southeast Asia in their biofuel plants, something which is associated with deforestation and extinction and all kinds of horrible things in Indonesia and other parts of the tropics. You can see, even back in January, we've had Naturally Green now for a few years, but even back in January, Bord na Móna says it will cease and source PKS's palm kernels in 2017 once it has an alternative domestic imported sustainable supply chains in place. In other words, we will be sustainable, but just not now. Here's another example. This is the Marine Stewardship Council. There aren't so many labels that look at the environmental performance of fish and fishing. Most people buy their fish or they order their fish in the supermarket without a second thought as to where it comes from, what type of an animal it is, or what kind of a life it has lived. So the Marine Stewardship Council has stepped in to tell us that if you choose the blue fish label and make sure the fish you eat can be traced back to a sustainable source, so a guilt-free way for us to enjoy our seafood. Now this, again, is only 2 weeks ago. Tesco, Marks and Spencer's and Waitrose voiced major concerns about the sustainability of tuna fisheries and complained to the Marine Stewardship Council about their blue tick label on some of these products, which are actually involved in bycatching turtles and sharks and all kinds of other endangered species. I saw even only yesterday a group of 66 environmental non-governmental organisations around Europe have written to the MSC to complain about their lack of standards in their standards. So for me, you can see why the whole concept of sustainability no longer has any meaning to anybody. If I talk to friends or family, they assume that sustainable means, well, it means there are no environmental problems associated with this product or with this decision. But clearly what has happened over the last 20 years is that sustainability has moved from the environmental department into the marketing department. And it really is little more than a marketing sideshow. And the problem with all of these marketing sideshows is that ultimately they get found out and they get busted. And we see that happening now with Origin Green, with the Marine Stewardship Council, with Bord Namona. And in the end, an awful lot of our money, our taxpayers' money, will have been spent on these lavish advertising campaigns that really serve to mislead the consumer. So if I am saying that sustainability is dead, clearly I'm not saying that we should all abandon our drive to improve our environmental performance. That is more urgent than ever. But how can we go about that then while moving away and abandoning the idea of sustainability? And I don't have any easy answers to that, but I do have some suggestions that I'll throw out to you before I finish up. One is called natural capital. It's basically an accounting technique that looks at the natural resources that a company uses, places a value on those natural resources that may be, maybe the amenity value, the aesthetic value, the flood value of a particular habitat or an area, and puts those on the balance sheet. And because it's an accountancy method, it's far more rigorous than woolly terms like sustainability. What about using clearer language? If you want to tell your customers that you're sustainable, tell them what that means. Does that mean that you don't pollute water? Does it mean that your activities are not resulting in the extinction of threatened species? If so, well then tell us, because otherwise we don't really know what it means. What about advertising standards? The Bord Namona advertising campaign was subject to a complaint to the Advertising Standards Authority, which was overruled. So clearly you can say these things and nobody's going to challenge you. And lastly, what about real investment? We put 30 million euro of our money, taxpayers' money, into Bord Bia last year, which is the body to market Irish food in the world. 30 million. We gave 12 million euro to the National Parks and Wildlife Service to actually go out and do the conservation work, to protect our rivers, to protect our forests, to make sure species like the curlew and the corncrake don't go extinct. So clearly the priorities are totally in reverse at the moment. So thank you very much. It's a very short period of time, but I hope I've given you something to think about there.
Padraic, thank you very much.